You ever noticed how everyone has an opinion on Gen Z? They're too soft, they're addicted to their phones, they can't hold a job, they're obsessed with mental health. They use therapy speak in every sentence. They're killing every industry that existed before them. But here's what almost nobody says. Their generation's psychology might be the most complex and misunderstood of any generation currently alive. And I'm not saying that to be nice. I'm saying it because the data is actually disturbing once you look at it clearly. Let's start with what shaped them more than anything else. Not phones, not TikTok, something far more foundational. Born between 1997 and 2012, they're the intern who reads the room faster than anyone but says nothing in the meeting. Your kid who knows exactly what they're feeling and tells you in precise clinical language. The generation that grew up with every answer in their pocket but can't seem to make a decision. And here's what nobody wants to sit with. Their generation didn't break. Their generation was handed a broken world and told to smile for the camera. They were the first generation to grow up entirely inside a performance. And I don't mean that metaphorically, I mean it literally. Picture this. It's 2012, you're 11 years old. You've had a smartphone for a year. You post a photo at school. Within 4 hours, you know exactly how many people liked it, who ignored it, who screenshotted it, and what 2 people said in comments you weren't supposed to see. You're 11, and you already have a quantified public identity. By the time the oldest Gen Z were teenagers, the average American child received their first smartphone at age 10, before they had fully formed prefrontal cortexes, before their brains had finished building the architecture that regulates self-worth, social comparison, and emotional regulation. They were dropped into a global popularity contest with permanent scoring. Gen X came home to an empty house and learned to be alone. Gen Z came home to a full house, notifications, comments, group chats, live streams, and somehow learned to be alone in a completely different way, surrounded by stimulation, starving for actual connection. Psychologists call it the spotlight effect on steroids. Gen Z had moments of self-consciousness. Gen Z had theirs documented, archived, and made searchable. That embarrassing photo from 7th grade doesn't fade, it lives. And their nervous systems adapted to that reality in ways we're only beginning to understand. But here's where it gets darker, because the performance came with a specific kind of betrayal. Gen Z watched their parents' generation preach stability. Work hard, play by the rules, get a degree, buy a house. Then they watched the 2008 financial crisis vaporize that promise in real time. Some of them were 10 years old sitting at breakfast while their parents explained why they were losing the house. They went to school under active shooter drills, not the Cold War's duck-and-cover feeder, actual rehearsals for being murdered in a classroom. They practiced hiding in closets. They memorized exit routes. They texted parents goodbye from under desks during lockdowns that turned out to be false alarms, except sometimes they weren't. Then COVID hit. The oldest were barely adults, the youngest were 11, and for anywhere between 1 and 3 years, depending on where you lived, normal development simply stopped. No school hallways, no lunch tables, no awkward first conversations that teach you how to exist around other people. They did all of it on a screen, with the camera on, performing presence in a box. Cigna's 2023 Loneliness Index reported Gen Z as the loneliest generation ever measured. Not because they lack social connections, they have thousands online, because they have almost no one who actually knows them. Psychologists call it ambient anxiety. It doesn't spike during a specific crisis, it just runs constantly underneath everything like a browser tab that never closes. Because for Gen Z, the crisis never actually ended, it just changed shape. Climate, economy, politics, social media outrage cycles that refresh every 48 hours. They didn't grow up between emergencies, they grew up inside a continuous one. And this is exactly why you see what looks like a paradox. They are the most mentally health literate generation in history. They can name their attachment style, explain their cognitive distortions, identify their trauma responses with clinical precision. And they are also the most mentally unwell. They're not broken because they understand psychology. They understand psychology because they've had to in order to survive it. This isn't self-indulgence, this is adaptation. Psychologists call this defensive self-awareness. When the world feels consistently unsafe, you turn inward and map every inch of yourself because that's the only territory you can actually control. There's this assumption that Gen Z is fragile, that all this mental health awareness is weakness dressed up in vocabulary. I want to dismantle that entirely, because once you look at what they actually do, the picture is completely different. Gen Z doesn't have a work ethic problem, they have a performance of work ethic problem, and those are completely different things. They watched millennials hustle post their way into burnout. They watched boomers give 40 years to a company that handed them nothing but a card signed by HR. The message landed hard. Performing loyalty to a system that doesn't perform loyalty back is not discipline, it's delusion. So they don't perform it. They won't pretend to be grateful for a job that underpays them. They won't stay late to look dedicated when dedicated doesn't pay rent. They won't smile through bad management and call it character building. And every older generation looks at that and says they're entitled. What they actually are is honest, which is far more threatening. Because here's the paradox. The same generation accused of not working hard enough launched more small businesses per capita than any generation before them, not because they're naturally entrepreneurial, because they absorbed the same lesson Gen X did. Every company will eventually fail you, but they absorbed it at 20 instead of 40, so they diversified early. Multiple income streams, personal brands, creator economies, skills that travel. They're not avoiding work, they're refusing to put all their survival into someone else's hands. Their relationship with authority follows the same logic. They don't respect titles, they respect transparency. A CEO who admits mistakes publicly earns more of their trust than one who projects perfect confidence. They grew up being able to Google any claim, fact-check any statement, expose any gap between what someone said and what someone did, and they weaponized that ability, not out of disrespect, out of having been lied to by institutions their entire lives and developing the tools to notice. There's this paradox at the core of Gen Z. They are the most publicly visible generation and the most privately guarded. They have thousands of followers who know their daily routines, and almost nobody who knows what they're actually afraid of. That's not contradiction, that's strategy. When you grow up learning that visibility is a liability, you learn to show everything and reveal nothing. You perform authenticity so precisely that real intimacy becomes the one thing you protect like it's classified. Research shows Gen Z reports some of the lowest rates of having a close confidant, not because they don't need one, because trust, real trust, is the rarest resource in a world built on curated feeds and manufactured relatability. Their relationship with information is different too. They have had every answer available instantaneously their entire conscious lives, and somehow that has made them worse at tolerating uncertainty, not better. Because when every question has an answer and you can't find one about your future, your finances, your planet, the absence of information doesn't feel like mystery, it feels like collapse. Their brains were trained on resolution. Ambiguity registers as threat. And now they're entering a world that is almost entirely ambiguous. No clear career paths, no reliable housing market, no consensus on what a functional life even looks like anymore. Gen X walked into uncertainty and shrugged. Gen Z walks into uncertainty and their nervous system sounds an alarm that was installed before they were old enough to question it. Here's the truth. Gen Z might be the first generation that never got a single moment of collective peace. Every generation before them had gaps between wars, between crises, between news cycles, where the noise stopped and something like normalcy existed. Gen Z never got a gap. The feed never paused. The crisis never fully resolved. The performance never ended. They're not better or worse than other generations. They're different in a way that has never existed before, shaped by a specific collision of forces: permanent digital visibility, institutional collapse, global crises compressing one after another that no generation had ever navigated simultaneously. They talk about their mental health because silence didn't work for the generations before them. They set boundaries because watching people without them destroyed themselves quietly. They question loyalty to systems because the systems demonstrated repeatedly that they don't deserve it. That's not weakness, that's evidence-based adaptation. They are the generation that grew up being seen by everyone and is still waiting to actually be understood. If this resonated with you, if you're Gen Z and felt seen for once without the footnote of a criticism, or if you're from another generation and finally understand why your kid, your coworker, or your student is wired the way they are, subscribe. I genuinely appreciate you being here.